alaikum. Namaste, Sri Akal. My name is Farheen Khan, and you're watching The Azeeza Show. Over the last several weeks, we've had a chance to talk about a number of interesting topics. We've talked about issues around domestic violence, around sexual violence. We've talked about some inspiring stories of women, their courage, their resilience. And today we're going to switch gears a bit and start talking about Islamophobia. And what it is, what it looks like, how it impacts people, and what we can do as both, individuals who identify as Muslims and also as allies. So with me today, I've got my guests. I've got Fizza, Mariam, Nouser, and Bill McBain. Thank you so much for being here today. So I want to kind of jump into the conversation and start to talk about, let's really talk about what does Islamophobia actually mean? Like, what's the definition? And then we can kind of, take it from there.
I can start. I think part of the issue is defining Islamophobia, and it's defined in multiple ways. So I referred to a report that was done by the Neurocultural Center, and what they defined Islamophobia as being the unfounded or irrational fear and or hatred of Islam or Muslims or people perceived to be Muslims, leading to violence and systemic discrimination.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What do you think, Mariam?
I think that's a really great way to define what Islamophobia is, because a lot of Islamophobia is systemic and it's done by our communities in general. And as somebody who has experienced Islamophobia, I feel it comes in different ways. It could be physical, it could be sometimes gender-based for myself as a visibly Muslim woman. It could be emotional abuse as well. So I think there are different variants of Islamophobia that can be defined as well.
And you're right to say that, it's both systemic, but it's also very individual, right? In terms of, and there's also that element of gender as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, Bill, what do you?
I think the definition is superb, and I think underlying the point about gender is, as being the most visible on the street example of Muslims, women often bear an unfortunate brunt, and they're often the most vulnerable. And the people who are often most vulnerable to any sort of discrimination of this type are people who are women or less economically advantaged, and because they're easier targets. And that's highly problematic. So I think the definition is excellent for a most unfortunate reality.
Yeah, so I guess I want to also take it to a little bit further than that. So now that we kind of understand what Islamophobia is, maybe, Mariam, you touched on it a little bit in terms of your lived experience, but tell us what Islamophobia, how it's played out, right? From the perspective of, you as Muslim women, as identified with Muslim individuals. And then I'd like to kind of ask Bill from an ally's perspective how he feels it's playing out as well.
Sure. I think that there's a lot of ways that Islamophobia is gendered, and it does, as Bill said, impacts Muslim women greatly. I think about my own experiences, and just whenever we hear of attack that has happened in our city or even beyond in our country, I think we're on heightened alert. So we're always very conscious of what's happening around us. We're in public spaces. When I know in the summer my windows are down in the car, I'm always very conscious of who's around me, what's being said. So I feel like in some ways, Muslim women are always walking around with this sort of low-level anxiety about what could potentially happen to them. I think about my children. I have two young girls, one in high school, one in university. And again, whenever we hear of a very public attack, and I'm talking now about very blatant Islamophobia, people being pushed, people being spat at, yelled at. I have to tell them, don't stand close to the subway tracks, and make sure you're aware of your surroundings. Where are you going to be? Make sure you're getting in touch. So those kind of precautions are the most obvious things. Right. But I also think of other ways in which we're looking at the niqab ban that's been happening, and that was proposed here by the Harper conservatives, but also in what's playing out in Quebec, and how women are then choosing to dress a certain way, are going to be withheld certain services and not have access to jobs and not have access to healthcare and education. So those kind of systemic ways that Islamophobia plays in. If you don't mind, I just want to read a few stats. Again, I go back to the Neurocultural Center's report because it was done very recently. And it had said that 46% of Canadians have an unfavorable view of Islam, more than any other religion. It says 56% of Canadians believe that Islam suppresses women's rights. More than half of people living in Ontario feel mainstream Muslim doctrines promote violence. 52% of Canadians feel that Muslims can't be trusted or can only be trusted a little or not at all. 42% think that Canadians think discrimination against Muslims is mainly their own fault. 51% support government surveillance of mosques compared to 46% of surveillance of other Americans. And 51% support government surveillance across, sorry, I said that one. And finally, 31% of Canadians approve of American President Donald Trump's restriction on travel bans for Muslims. So just to, statistically look at what the sentiment is out there and what, the Muslim community is dealing with when they just sort of going about their regular lives.
Well, thank you for sharing those stats. And
Yeah,
I think
no
it's definitely eye-opening. I think it's something that a lot of us know just because of our, our day-to-day interactions. But it's nice to. It's unfortunate, but it's good that this allows others to have a sense of like how much we're dealing with.
Yeah. I think Islamophobia also, as blatant as a lot of the attacks may be, it also comes in forms of microaggressions and comments that people make, people in your life that could also make these comments, or assumptions that, hey, just because you're Muslim, just doesn't mean you can't do X, Y, and Z. And I feel that it's important for us to remember that even the closest ones to us can be Islamophobes. Even though you've been in their life for a long time, or you've kind of shown Islam in a positive light, there are still people who will take Islam for not for what it is, which is a peaceful religion. It's a religion of justice, of positivity, of hope. So I think people need to be cognizant of that. And as somebody who's experienced Islamophobia both on a large scale and as through microaggressions as well, I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
And would you be willing to tell us, like, give us an example of something?
Sure, I'll give you an example of one of the main events in my life that's happened, and then a microaggression. So I was on the subway going to university back in 2014, and I had only been wearing the hijab for about a year. And I usually have my headphones on. I like to keep my space and like to keep quiet, and I just like to be in my own zone when I'm traveling. And I was approaching St. George Station when I noticed this woman looking really funny at me. And I didn't take much notice to that because I'm used to getting these dirty looks. And then after that, I was getting up because I usually get up a couple stops before mine, which is Bloor Yonge Station, just to stretch and get ready to get out at that station. And I felt some wet thing on my scarf. Because I was wearing a thin scarf at the time. Keep in mind it was July, so I wasn't wearing a really thick cotton scarf. And I looked over, and she was saying, "Go back to where you came from." And so I had to turn off my music for a second, and I said, "Hey, going back to where I came from is Etobicoke. I was born and raised here, right? So you can't really tell me where I should go because this is my home as much as it is your home." And then she stopped for maybe 30 seconds, and as we were approaching Bloor Yonge Station, she started tugging at my hijab. And luckily the doors opened at Bloor Yonge so I could get out, and she didn't follow me. But that really scared me, and I ended up taking off my hijab for 6 months after that. I took about 2 weeks to really contemplate on my situation. And from there, I decided to take it off to really strengthen my faith and I'm not visibly Muslim when I take my hijab off because of my fair skin. So I was able to kind of hide my identity, which I recognize as a privilege of mine. And I was able to grow stronger and really hone in my faith. So that was one of the main events in my life that really changed my perspective of Islamophobia and how rude people can be. And another time I was driving home from work. I used to work part-time at Starbucks, and I had my windows down, like Fizza was saying, how you have to be wary when you have your windows down in the summertime. And some guy was saying, "Be careful, she might have a bomb in her car." So it was really disheartening to hear that. It didn't really bother me because at that time I had grown a thick skin. But again, it's something subtle like that that can really affect your mood, and it can affect your outlook on things. And as an engineering student and being in a program with very little females, I noticed that I have to work extra hard as a visibly Muslim woman just to prove to myself in my labs that I'm capable enough to do the work. For example, I'm the only girl in one of my labs this semester, and I feel like because I'm a visibly Muslim person and I'm also a female, it's really hard for me to show that, hey, I'm actually capable of doing the work as much as you are, and I've really had to go above and beyond in my work. So again, those microaggressions, the way people look at you, the way people talk to you, it's different.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sorry that those are some of the experiences that you've had. I know that, you know, I've also talked about my experiences, like, you know, in previous shows we've talked about being attacked in an elevator and stuff like that after 9/11. And it's just, you know, it really does take a toll on you. It certainly, you know, has changed my life path as well. I don't think I would be doing the kind of work that I'm doing today, or working in, you know, social justice related kind of work. Perhaps I would be busy trying to break the cycle of poverty for my family and be in the corporate sector trying to do that. But certainly we all have, you know, a lot of different experiences that really, I think, you know, at the end of the day, unfortunately, are things that we still need to speak up about. It's really important for us to, you know, to verbalize like what's happening, because that's, you know, people don't sometimes understand the impact that Islamophobia has when we're actually when we're silent about it.
I also think a lot of people Muslims themselves don't recognize it. So I was thinking about an experience my daughter had where she's not an art student, but she loves art and she does really well in art. And she had handed in a project where she was supposed to make a superhero sort of idea. And she had worked really long and hard on it. And she decided, and both of my children have decided to wear hijab on their own. I've never said anything to them about it. So she had made this sort of armor, Joan of Arc type of image, and she said, hijab is my armor. And she was pretty proud of it, and her teacher had said to her, I don't know, that's kind of cliche. And this idea of, and she was really upset, and this idea that a white man can just invalidate something that matters to her. Art is, of course, very subjective. I don't think that anybody has any kind of right to grade something and decide on its validity based on their experience as a privileged white man. So, you know, my daughter was really upset, but didn't identify that as Islamophobia.
Right.
And I had to talk her through it and say, look, he has all these assumptions about what hijab is, what armor is, what makes powerful and strong women, and it's not his right to impose that on you. Right. And so, you know, young kids are dealing with this in schools, the attitudes that their teachers bring to the classrooms. Yeah. It's not always as blatant, as horrible as Mariam's experiences. It's not always as blatant, but it hurts quite deeply.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's great. So just before we continue, Bill, I want to come back to you. We're just going to take a quick break,
sure,
and then we'll be back. Okay, welcome back. This is the Azeeza show, and we've been talking about the issue of Islamophobia. So we were just talking to Mariam and Fizza here about sort of the impact that Islamophobia has on women, on individuals that identify as Muslims. I really want to hear also, though, with our guest Bill, about, you know, what your experience has been around how Islamophobia kind of plays out.
Well, I think the descriptions of our sisters over here have been very moving, and I think a very common experience for women who are visibly Muslim. I work in health equity a lot. I have been over the last few years, and I'm in a situation where I'm dealing with Indigenous communities and with African Canadian communities, and the experiences are very similar in that the way people, in their fear and their ignorance of others in society, the messages they pick up from various forms of media and culture, they express that fear. And even though those experiences and those influences happen on a large plane, like an international event or Donald Trump or something you see in the media or an unfortunate comment by a politician in Canada, the impact is very personal.
Mm-hmm.
Very personal and very individual. And the greatest expression of the tragedy of Islamophobia and other forms of discrimination is that it impacts people's in a very local way, in their homes, in their life, and it makes it a challenge for how they perceive themselves in the greater society. And that we have such impressive women as the three of you and others who overcome that, in fact, draw on those experiences that make them stronger, and is an impressive thing. Not always what happens, so a lot of people are harmed by this. And it's an experience across the board in a range of cultures. The irony, of course, is that Canada is in many ways an example to the world. We have cultures from everywhere. And in fact, in the Greater Toronto Area, in the GTA where we live right now, we're all sort of, we are the world. And that's the great strength of the country. And as people get to know each other better in a very personal way, and are not as troubled or afraid or ignorant of the other person, they get to, I think, enjoy the real richness of our culture in our country. But we have to get past that. The work that UMA is doing, for instance, which is an organization called Uniting Muslims and Allies for Humanity, is that it's attempting in its way, as our other organizations and other efforts, to create that personal, intimate experience where people engage in the community, events where people engage, may meet each other, and they get to know more about what the personal experience of Islam is for other people and other cultures, of course, and exchange that and understand the richness of the variety that we have in our communities.
Oh, that's great. I know that we've been able to do a number of them over the last couple of years, and it's been really important to have like those critical conversations, right? It's important
Absolutely.
to be able to humanize people again, and and that's part of the conversation, the discussion, right? Is that it's so easy to dehumanize people, and when we have leaders, political leaders, unelected officials that are using such irresponsible rhetoric, there is a direct impact on people's lives, right? And we need to be aware of that, so be able to challenge that. That's where we have these spaces, these safe spaces where we can have those discussions. So I also want to kind of move into we've talked about sort of some individual experiences. Let's talk a little bit about the Quebec City mosque massacre and what happened there. I know I personally had a chance to go to the mosque and meet some of the families as well, but let's talk about sort of what that was like when you heard about it. How did you feel when it happened? How much has that really impacted kind of your day-to-day living since?
I think it was quite a shock, because we hear of different Islamophobic attacks happening in the States, and as close as the States is, it's still far away for us. And so the fact that something like of this caliber happened in our own land was very troubling to hear and very saddening. I remember I was sitting and studying when I heard about the massacre, and I was almost in tears. The fact that 6 individuals who were taken after they were praying, they have the freedom to practice whatever religion they want, and they were just praying in a sacred space, and they lost their lives to a man with sick ideologies. And it's so important to recognize that yes, these times are very debilitating because they attack us at our core, but it was also a time that Muslims band together and allies came together to really do some good. For example, recently we've seen a crowdfunding page for Ayman, who was one of the survivors of the massacre, and $400,000 was raised for him to have an accessible home so he can finally be with his family again. It's so important for people to use this, use times of bad to create something good out of it, and we can't just let ourselves play the victim all the time. As much as it is easy to fall into that trap, we must rise above that and have allies like yourself, Bill, who are vocal with these issues, to stand with us, to work hard, and to really create a positive impact in our society, like it has done with the Quebec shooting. And now we've seen a lot of cities across the country commemorate January 29th as a day of, against Islamophobia, which is so important to recognize as well, because Islamophobia it affects so many people in this great nation of ours, and it's important to recognize that Islamophobia affects almost everybody here.
It's not just Muslims, right?
Yeah.
There's others that are, of different faiths even, that are, people from the Sikh community, for example, that are being targeted as well.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I thought I don't remember where I was, to be honest, but I do remember having a distinct feeling in Ramadan this year. So usually Ramadan is our spiritual month where we sort of don't have our day-to-day regular practices. We're fasting, we're praying, we're trying to be more connected to our Creator. And there's a lot of times where Muslims visit the mosque way more often than they do other times of the year. So that time of the year, usually on the weekends, we are at the mosque and we're there really late at night, sometimes 2 a.m., 3 a.m. And I remember that that was the one place where you have solace, where you're like, this is where I have peace. I don't have kids that I have to tend to. I don't have other work. Like, this is my time to really reflect, to really sort of build my inner spiritual self. But I do remember this year feeling very conscious about what's happening around me. So even when we prostrate, the way Muslims pray, they put their heads down, and that's a way of submission to God. And that is supposed to be one of our most spiritually connected ways that we prostrate, and to think that peace was broken, because in our particular mosque there's like 2 doors that are just in the area where we pray, and they're usually always locked, but they're glass doors. We don't enter through those doors, but the way it's built. And when everybody was prostrating, I always thought, like, nobody's watching those doors. It's 2 a.m. Any potential thing could happen. So just that loss of peace, even in the one time of the year where we're allowed to have that peace, was really difficult for me to think about that. And I also want to make the connection back to people of this nation who have lost that peace a long time ago. So when we think about allies, and we think about and Bill was talking about Indigenous people, and our Black brothers and sisters who were here and who have been slaves in Canada, that they had never had this safety. So the safety that I feel a loss now, like say since 9/11, I want to acknowledge and recognize that Indigenous and Indigenous racism and anti-Black racism has affected people since the beginning of Canada, since colonization.
Absolutely.
So just as we are happy to see allies come forward and resist Islamophobia, as Muslims we want to build allyships with Indigenous people and Black people to make sure that we understand that these racisms are different, but are also rooted in white supremacy, and they come from the same sort of underbelly of that. So a lot of pushing back will be in those kind of allyships.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate you saying that, because you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right. I mean, we need to, this is one of the things that I was talking about a lot when I was running in the election campaign as well in 2015. Federally was, just that, if we expect to stand with other if we expect others to stand with us when we were talking about the issue of Bill C-51 and the added security measures and the impact that would potentially have on Muslims, right? We also need to be able to stand with our allies and ensure that we stand up for justice for all people, right? That's really important. Bill, did you want to?
I just wanted to add what I think is a very positive story. In the book, I lost my train of thought there, but it's a fact that one of the groups and the young children who've been most sensitive to the challenges of Indigenous children, and particularly around Shannon's Dream and availability of school and that sort of thing, some of the most empathetic groups have been young Muslim kids who feel a great connection to young children in northern Ontario and in northern Canada and other parts of the country who are trying to get decent schooling. And that is it's a horrific problem, but it's a great connection. The book is called Children of the Broken Treaty, by the way. But there are other examples of that where people find common cause, and that's how we link and deal with ignorance and find real brotherhood and sisterhood with others going through similar connections. So that was a superb comment you made, so thank you.
Thank you. So we don't have a lot of time left. This has been a really interesting conversation. I'm really glad that we've been able to talk about it. Both from a systemic perspective, but also at an individual level, and then a perspective with our ally here as well. I guess the one other thing I really want to touch on briefly is the issue of media and how we need to do better. I think we have some allies in the media now, thankfully, but there's a lot that are still out there who are still sort of feeding into that narrative, right? That Muslims, quote or not, are the other, and that are very problematic. So I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done around that, and hopefully we can get some individuals from the media on the show at another point to discuss that. But do you have any last minute kind of thoughts or that you'd like to share with the audience? Anyone?
Yeah, the media plays a huge role in how people perceive marginalized communities in particular. For example, if you see somebody who's Indigenous or black and Muslim, Indigenous and Muslim, or Muslim, anybody of these marginalized communities, if they have committed a crime, you see a mugshot. But if you see a white person committing a crime, you see somebody on vacation, or you see somebody doing something on their day-to-day lives. So we criminalize our marginalized communities, in particular Muslims, black folks, Indigenous people as well, but we don't do the same for white people. And the same goes to when marginalized folks are victims. There's barely any coverage with that, but if you see a massacre or people who are white that are being killed, there's a big to-do about that. So I guess it's to start as fair media coverage when it comes to these types of massacres, because death of any innocent person is horrible, no matter who they are, where they're from. But it's important to make sure that everybody gets their fair justice when it comes to media coverage, and that people are well aware of what's happening.
Yeah, no, thank you. So I think that's it. We've run out of time. I want to take a moment to thank all of you for being with me today. And as you've heard, Islamophobia is an issue that many of us are dealing with, whether you identify as Muslim or not. It certainly has an impact. It's our job as individuals to ensure that we hold our leaders accountable, elected, unelected, doesn't matter, that we hold the media accountable, that we ensure that we're always sort of active and taking a role in making the world a better place. So thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you next week.